out in the Rocky Mountains, near where you come from. And so people then were greatly intrigued with this new medium. When I made the decision, which a lot of people thought was crazy, to move from NBC, where I was the number 3 man in the number 1 network, to become president of ABC News, which was the number 3 network, and I become the number 1 man at the number 3 network news. So that's the gamble I took. I was then 50 years old. Let's see, one of my boys was in prep school at Andover, I guess at that time, 1963. Maybe one was at Yale, but Yale and Andover probably is where they were at the time. But at any rate, I had a couple of big tuitions to pay every year. Otherwise, my finances were in good shape, but I did insist on an unbreakable 5-year contract. Pay or play. I mean, if they wanted to fire me, they could fire me, but they'd have to pay dollar for dollar. So that was what I call my protection. I was 50. I had been in the Social Security system, of course, since it started in 1936. So I didn't figure it was an unacceptable gamble to go with somebody who didn't have a pension system, but they didn't. And the reason they didn't is that had they been wanting to establish a pension system, they would have had to blanket in all of the people who worked for all these 2,000 motion picture houses around the country, and that would be ticket sellers and ushers and managers and janitors and projectionists at the theaters and whatnot. That was Leonard had so many other financial problems with this new company, ABC United Paramount Theaters. The main one being good programming. So any money that he could raise or had to go into that, or acquiring new stations, new affiliated stations. Both NBC generally had the stations that had come on the air first, going back to radio days, like they have, say, KSL in Salt Lake City or WDAF in Kansas City, where I come from. And that was the Kansas City Star, and they just owned the town. So anything that Leonard would do in, say, Kansas City, he'd have the 3rd-rated station in the town, and God knows when it was going to ever become the 2nd-rated, let alone the 1st-rated. So anyway, I took that gamble. The salary wasn't too great. I think I went there for, it might have been $43,000 a year on a permanent 5-year contract. I was making maybe $27,500 at ABC, and I did have at NBC, excuse me, at NBC, and they had a bonus at the end of the year, and I believe you got some stock options, which weren't great in my category.
Now, granted, it was a gamble.
Yeah.
But in retrospect, do you sometimes wish that you would have stayed at NBC? I mean, Bill McAndrews, as it turned out, passed away, and
yeah, and Bob Kentner got fired for being a drunk, which I better explain. As I've said it, well, I've made a few mistakes during my career, about my career. I've never really looked back and kicked myself in the behind for them. I don't think anybody has 20/20 vision on some things. Some of us are smarter than others, and I've always done something a job which I found interesting. not with an eye on top dollar, how much money I could squeeze out of it. Like, you know, like starting on a daily newspaper, going to wire services, going into photojournalism at a time when it was just starting out. So those were all really very exciting things to do in the journalism field, which is all I was really ever interested in. That's what I'd been taught at the University of Missouri, going back early 1930s. So at any rate, why I might have fared better had I stayed at NBC, and this is highly speculative, but my number one boss there in the news department was Bill McAndrew, who was a very fine gentleman and a fair enough newsman. I wouldn't say he was the greatest in the world, but and he was one of the leading Catholics in New York. And all these organizations in New York have a leading Catholic in them. And Bill McAndrew was a Knight of Malta, and he was very well known there. And like I mentioned John Coleman a while ago, who was on the ABC board. He was the big Catholic at ABC, and so on. Anyway, Bill McAndrew was the president of the news department, and Julian Goodman, who had run the Washington office of NBC News for many years, had been promoted to be his number two man. He was vice president of news, and so he outranked me. And McAndrew was maybe a year or two younger than I was, and Julian was a good 10 years younger. He was a great friend of David Brinkley's, and he could hold Brinkley in line. And so I figured that as I was 50 years old at the time, in 1953, in 1963, I was 50 years old. I figured I wasn't going to get too many chances. There were only 3 jobs in network television news at that time, head of CBS News, NBC News, and ABC. And I'd left CBS to go to NBC, so I wasn't going to get the job there. That was certain. They weren't going to hire me back. And I didn't think I had a very good chance of overtaking McAndrew and then later Goodman. Well, as it happened, I might have become the president of NBC News, because within the year, Bill McAndrew had a rather odd accident. He slipped in his bathtub at home while taking a shower, had suffered some internal injury that was misdiagnosed at a local hospital, and died within a couple of days. I went to his funeral, and so that Goodman went up one step there, and then later, very shortly, he wasn't president of the news department very long, when he went up another step, when Bob Kintner, who was president of the company, of the NBC company, National Broadcasting Company, Bob Kintner had a drinking problem, and General Sarnoff, the head of RCA, which was the owner of NBC, became very uneasy with him, and he gradually eased Goodman into the job of president of the company. First he sort of was an understudy to Kintner, and then one time when Kintner had some big incident going through an airport to a meeting of affiliates in Mexico City, and sort of fell down, disgraced himself in public, Sarnoff finally had enough of it, and he fired Kintner. And Goodman became president of the National Broadcasting Company. So Reuben Frank became the head of NBC News, and he'd been the producer, executive producer of the Huntley-Brinkley Report. At any rate, but that's all speculation. And
but that might have been you.
It could have been, probably what. I was in line for it. I left at a time when Kintner was in Europe. If Kintner had also been in the United States, he might have been persuasive enough to have persuaded me to stay at NBC. but they had two guys. They had a personnel, a guy named George Fuchs and Bobby Sarnoff, who was the general's son. They put them to work on me to try to get me to stay with NBC, and Bobby Sarnoff wasn't the guy to do it. I mean, he wasn't saying what I wanted to hear. So that's the way that happened. Anyway, I took the big gamble, and it was the only job open to build too. It was a building job, which I like, because NBC, CBS already had its reputation, much as you could say largely through the reputation of Edward R. Murrow. So that wasn't going to, I wasn't going to, whoever was going to go there and be head of the news department was going to inherit a reputation and wouldn't have to build it from scratch. NBC under Kintner, Kintner had devoted a lot of money to news and had done a good job of pushing the news department forward, and Huntley and Brinkley were going strong, so they had a pretty good organization, so that wasn't a building job. So there wasn't anything else. There wasn't any CNN or anybody else. Any cable didn't exist at that time as it does today.
I have an observation I want you to
Yeah.
think about, and that is, it seems, as I look at, and I may be wrong here, but as I look at the pioneers of television news,
Yeah.
of which you are one,
Yeah,
most of them came from either print or film
yeah,
or radio.
yeah,
Okay.
that's true.
You did not have a background in radio. You had a background in print, but something different that I think you have is the wire photos.
Photojournalism.
The photojournalism. Weren't
Yeah.
you about the only photojournalist?
Well, I was certainly the first of any stature that they hired. They did get people from newsreels,
Right.
the old commercial newsreels that they used to play in the motion picture theaters. They hired some people from there. Yeah, I guess I was the most prominent photojournalist that they hired, and that's when Mickelson hired me originally to come to CBS. As I had worked my way up, you know, like starting as a reporter on a daily newspaper and then wire services, so that sort of gives you a national or world outlook. If you're working for the UP or the AP, you always know that eventually, if you're there long enough, you're probably going to get to see the world and work in various bureaus all over the world just by keeping your nose clean and doing a decent job. So I was beginning then, see, because photojournalism started in about 1936, a good 10 years before television even was local. And Luce did that, and Noir Photo started in the mid-30s, and AP started that. So those things all together, it seemed to me that they were just preparing me for something like television. So when it came along, I began to look around a little bit to try to find some contacts that I could even talk to. And I remember coming to New York one time, a time when I was working for Life in LA. This would be about 1950, and trying to find some contacts. And I didn't have any at that time in radio or television, and it wasn't until later that through an old friend and through Sig Mickelson that I made the entry. But I had print, okay. I had visuals through Life, and I'd also worked for Acme News Pictures for 2 or 3 years. So I knew how to tell a story with news and pictures. Now, so far I didn't have sound and I didn't have motion. So what I had to do when going into television was to find out how you melded together sound and motion. And that's what Mickelson took the gamble on when he hired me. Now, when I had worked for the High Commission in Germany, we had a huge, you could call it propaganda organization, but it was rebuilding the whole mass media of Germany which had to be rebuilt because it had all been run by the Nazis up until the end of World War II. So we had a really big organization. We had our own newsreel for Germany. We covered and distributed newsreel to German picture houses. We had 3 daily newspapers. We had Heute, H-E-U-T-A means today, which was a photojournalism magazine. So, and then we had radio. We had RIAS in Berlin, which stands for Rundfunk im Amerikanischen Sektor, RIAS. And RIAS was a huge station with its own symphony orchestra, its own chamber music orchestra. I mean, so while I didn't have hands-on experience with running a radio station, the job I had involved a sort of general supervision of all those media. Wire service, feature service, the whole works. It was a huge thing.
Don Hewitt and others have, in fact, when Don Hewitt created 60 Minutes, I think he said that he was aspiring to create on television what already existed in magazines, kind of a life magazine of the air.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, was that not something that crossed your mind earlier? Don Hewitt?
Yeah, but yes. Well, we tried weekly magazines, not in the format of 60 Minutes or any of those that you can think of today, but we would try to do a review of the week and stuff like that in the early days of television. But remember, at the time I went in, which was September 14th, 1953, we were mainly concerned with daily coverage of the news for television in 16mm film, single system sound. And so we had to devote all of our efforts to that. And a magazine, I suppose we were thinking that was the logical step farther down the road. But CBS had Murrow. So it had See It Now. And so...
person to person.
Well, person to person was never in the news department. Right. But nevertheless, it was something like as much in the news department as some magazine shows are today. CBS was person to person was Ed Murrow interviewing 2 celebrities each week. That's the basic format. At any rate, I had always had jobs of concentrating on, well, let's say hard news for want of a better expression. And then when Mickelson hired me and kept me in Washington for a year before he brought me up to New York, he had 2 things that were on his agenda, and because he had to deal with the management, he couldn't do it in a hands-on way, and he saw me as somebody who was a pretty good organizer and could do that, and one of them was coverage of presidential elections and gathering the results on election night. And another one was sports, because sports was in the news department at that time. Did we talk about the National Football League? We talked about that, okay.
Oops.
So, but that's what he wanted to do, and that's how, through Mickelson's interest in this, which had started when he was working for WCCO in Minneapolis, probably on the radio side at that time, because he thought that the AP and the UP, and there was a third one, INS, the Hearst service at that time, he thought they were doing a terrible job on election night, that they were too slow. And he wanted something that he could get on the air before people went to bed. So even back then, you can say that there was a little pressure to get the figures early. People are saying today, well, what difference does it make? Well, maybe it doesn't make any difference. I don't know. Each person can have his own opinion on that. But that's what Mickelson's objective was. If you look at the sets in use on television throughout the United States, you will see that they start falling off first about 9 o'clock Eastern time, and a few people drop out then, those who have jobs where you have to go to work early, and then more drop out at 10 o'clock, and then at 11 o'clock, a habit is people go to bed after 11 o'clock news, 10 o'clock in the Midwest, and what's in the mountains? 10 o'clock?
Yeah.
That's the bedtime news?
Yeah, 10 o'clock.
KSL?
Except for Fox is 9.
Yeah, but KSL traditionally has had news at 10, so the mountain states are
They're like Central.
similar to Central, yeah. So at any rate, that was one of the first things that Mickelson had me doing, was to seeing what we could do to create this system. So there were so many things. What the point you're talking about, magazines. It looked like, looking at what we could do and accomplish, that magazines and various other type shows were farther down the line.
Now, you mentioned that you like to build, and that was what made ABC attractive to you. It was a place that needed to build.
There was a lot of
lot to do.
Yeah, more building to do.
Well, and several years ago, you're aware of a book that came out in which I don't recall the author's name, but he claims that Roone Arledge built ABC News. Who do you think built ABC News?
A lot of people. Me and my staff. Roone Arledge, he's a Johnny-come-lately. I don't even consider him a journalist. No. Roone came in 1977. Well, that's after I took it over. I think I could claim that title without boasting too much about it. The job I did was a lot harder than anything he ever had to do. Much to work with, no much, and a lousy lineup of stations. I mean, I did more honest to God groundwork than he ever thought of doing, all of which he inherited. Well, I built a station lineup from 100 stations to about 195, just for one thing. In other words, of the ABC affiliates, when I came there, it was about maybe 95 stations carrying the news, 100 at maximum. And at the height of Frank Reynolds and Howard K. Smith, we had 195. I can't remember the exact audience figures, but they were commensurate with the number of stations. So the record's pretty good. I'm satisfied with the record, and I think most of the people. But one person never builds is never responsible. I mean, I've never claimed that I was the only one who ever had was responsible for. I was the president. The president, of course, takes the raps and also gets some of the credit. But there were so many people who contribute to it. I mean, guys like Wally Pfister and Sid Darian and people who were producing the news every night, because the president of a large news organization like that can't sit there all day long and say, well, this is what's going to be on Peter Jennings tonight, or this is what Frank Reynolds and Howard K. Smith are going to do. I may be over-arguing with Leonard Goldenson to increase the budget so we can have another bureau in the Far East. And stuff like that is vital, and that's what I spent a lot of my time doing. I had to sell the top management and, in effect, the board of directors of ABC on gradually investing more money. I told them when I arrived there, I thought I could do something for them in 5 years. Cy Siegel once said, well, you didn't do it in 5, but you did it in 7. So what? You shouldn't feel bad about that. So that was his words, his phrase. He thought it up. So that means by 7 years, that would be by about 1970. He was happy. He was the executive vice president and the money bags of the company. He was very happy with the way it had gone, and that he didn't think 7 years was too much to accomplish something at all. But you know, I don't know whether we've ever covered this, but when NBC was so upset when I moved to ABC that they appointed Julian Goodman. Kittner appointed him. He was the guy who had to anticipate what I'd do and to counteract it, or to do it first. And that was crazy, because NBC had a very good news organization, and they didn't. I don't think they need to worry too much about me. I was worried about just about cranking up an organization that could cover the news all over the world. Covering the news is very expensive in visuals, in television. And you know, here we were going from, I mentioned a while ago that we were using single system sound, and then we went to color, and then, you know, and you have to retool for all those things when you make the changes. They're not just you say, well, we're going out and buy some color film and throw away all the black and white. Then Ampex came along in the mid-1950s with videotape, and so the newsreel organizations, it was apparent to people who worked there that as motion pictures houses decreased in number, that it wasn't going to be long before the newsreels were a dinosaur, dead as a dodo. And so you could get people to come from the newsreels if you could afford to pay them enough, competitive salaries, because the newsreels just gradually faded out. There were two syndicates, UPITN, well, it was first was UP Fox, Movietone was one of them, and Telenews, which was a Hearst organization. And Nick Archer worked for them before he came to ABC. So occasionally one of those guys would get fed up, and Paramount had a newsreel, and Pathé had one. But their cameramen tended to be getting a little old in the tooth. So while we did hire some of them, you couldn't staff your whole organization with people in their 50s and 60s. Cameramen that you're asking to have a little daring do and fresh ideas and stuff like that, you need some who are in their mid-20s and 30s, and you know, journalism schools weren't teaching anything like that at the time. In Hollywood there were some film schools, but almost nobody was teaching.
Were you telling Missouri they should be doing that?
Not at that point. What's going on there? You must be on a board, yes, or NBC to ABC. It wasn't an easy job, well, sometimes if a guy had, sometimes I was even hesitant to get a guy to leave a good career somewhere, especially if he had a family. Because while I was taking a chance on my career, and I made my commitment to do it, I didn't feel like somebody at NBC that might have been helpful to me and had 3 or 4 kids, I'd think, and I certainly didn't lead anybody down the garden path. One guy I would like to have had from NBC and talked to him a number of times off and on over the years was Ed Newman. And Ed wasn't going to be our great star. He wasn't going to be the Peter Jennings like the anchor man, but he would have been very valuable on a number of other things. And He was a strong newsman. He was a very good writer, and he's written books on the English language. And he would have been a leading lady in television news at the time, whom I had inherited when I took over ABC News, a woman named Lisa Howard. That wasn't her real name, that was her stage name. She had some German Jewish name. And so she had been there, and she eventually, well, she got involved in politics, which is a no-no, I mean, in supporting a candidate. Okay. And as a matter of fact, eventually she committed suicide right here in East Hampton, in the parking lot downtown. I think she took an overdose of pills. So that job was open, and we had very few women in the organization, newswomen in the organization at the time, and Jesse knew about Marlene Sanders, I think, through Mike Wallace. I believe she must have been working for Westinghouse at the time. So yeah, we hired her at that time.
How was your relationship with her?
How's what?
How was your relationship with her?
Well, she doesn't write very well. She's not very complimentary about me in her book, and even said something about my first wife, which I didn't appreciate, which was incorrect, but and she had no reason to, no grounds for saying it. Well, she didn't like me because she wanted to be on the air more. After that News with a Woman's Touch, after that she was finished with that, she wanted, say, to be a regular reporter for Smith and Reynolds. And at that time, Ov Weston was the producer of it. Ov Weston didn't particularly like it on the air, and she wanted me to overrule Weston and order him to use her more on the air. I said, I'm not going to do it.
You mentioned she said uncomplimentary things about you in her book. One of the ones she thought that you were old-fashioned when it came to treatment of women in the workplace.
Yeah, she said because of my relations with my wife, who was a submissive woman. She didn't use submissive, but that's what it says. Well, I didn't think that was true myself. I have, long before women would aspire to news jobs or on-camera jobs with television, I helped many of them get the hardest job to do for any woman at that, going back 30 years ago or 40 years ago, was to get out of the secretarial class. People weren't hiring many, even college women at that time. College women often had to go to work as secretaries to get their foot in the door. And I helped a lot of girls.
Betsy Aaron, for example.
Betsy Aaron was one of them, yeah. But even then, when I was running the NBC bureau in Washington, there were women down there that I pointed the way and showed them how they could get into what I call the professional class rather than the secretarial class. But she didn't know anything about that. And Marlene Sanders didn't. She didn't interview me for the book. I think she had been to dinner once at our apartment in New York, and I guess she formed her opinion on what she thought was my relations with my first wife. My first wife was a little retiring in her side, but she was an immigrant to this country, and she had worked her way up, and while she openly, she wasn't as declarative as many young women are today, she had a lot of influence on me. But she didn't raise her voice. She wasn't an aggressive woman. She was a bilingual secretary for foreign companies. She wrote shorthand in both English and French. She came to this country when she was 10 years old. I think I explained that to you. Anyway. That's what she said, but it was mainly because Ov Weston wouldn't use her. But, you know, later, I thought Marlene Sanders in her book was also unappreciative of the fact. Bill Sheehan, after I left, Bill Sheehan made her a vice president in charge of documentaries. Marlene has a big ego, and if the jobs she's offered don't measure up to what she thinks she should have, then it's not her fault. It's the guy making the decision. A lot of people react like that, but okay, she's got her every right to say it, but I don't think it's right. I saw her a couple of years ago at Lou Ciaffi's funeral, and you know, we said hello, and I don't spit in her eye. It's a long time ago, I mean. But that's the background of it.
Some folks called the ABC jokingly back then all broads and Canadians.
I don't know, well, we didn't have that many Canadians. Two I remember. Just Jennings and Barry Dunsmore. There might have been one. Maybe we had a producer who was a Canadian. I didn't pay much attention to that. And all broads. Well, let's see, who were the broads? Beside Marlene, who did we have? We had a number of women who were very good and very talented, but weren't necessarily on camera. Like good tape editors. I mean, I know a woman of German extraction, Henrietta Hune, who was a videotape editor in news.